Hello, everybody. My name is Micah Strodes, and welcome back to another episode of Micah Spotlight, a podcast where people give their perspective on real-world events. Before I introduce the two individuals joining me for today's episode, in the previous podcast with Travis, in the comment section, Song asked, "What is your greatest life moment?" So I want to take this opportunity to answer that question. Well, Song, for some reason, I really don't reflect on my past accomplishments. Once I reach my goal, my mind automatically goes into what's next mode. However, something I will never forget is my podcast with Scott Douglas. I was a huge Monster Truck fan growing up, practically obsessed with it. Scott Douglas was Monster Jam's announcer and commentator. I grew up watching him on TV, interviewing my favorite drivers like Dennis Anderson, Tom Mintz, Charlie Pauken, that's just to name a few. And I sent him a direct message stating that I was a huge Monster Jam fan and I would love for him to be on the podcast to talk about his life and career. And to my surprise, he actually got back with me and agreed to do it. And 3 days before the biggest podcast of my life, I think I come down with the coronavirus. I'm not joking. Literally, I had all the symptoms, but at the time, since it was the first week of March, I believed that the virus was still only in China. But many people believe that the virus had already been in the United States long before that. The night before the podcast, I literally only got 3 hours of sleep. I felt like garbage. I had chills, but nothing was going to stop me from having this podcast with Scott Douglas. We get on the podcast, everything works out fine, but right after the podcast was over, I went upstairs and fell asleep. It was such an honor talking to him because this is a person that I grew up watching on TV and watching on DVDs all the time. And the fact that I had the opportunity to talk to him a little bit more than an hour, I was completely honored. But yes, that's my greatest life moment so far, and hopefully more to come. Guys, remember that you can listen to Micah Spotlight in audio form on SoundCloud at Micah Spotlight. Follow Micah Spotlight on Twitter and Facebook, all at Micah Spotlight. Don't forget to follow the podcast on Instagram at Micah, MICAH _Spotlight 24. Lastly, subscribe not only to Micah Spotlight, but to my second YouTube channel, Micah Spotlight Clips, where you will get the highlights from each and every podcast. The two guests I have on today's episode is one of my lifelong friends, Vanessa Bossard, and Mr. Daniel Blair. Vanessa works in ministry and is also a writer. Mr. Daniel is the youngest of 5 and a father of 4. He runs 4 outpatient clinics for a spinal specialist. Mr. Daniel is also currently working on starting a nonprofit organization that promotes education and resources concerning race, sexuality, religion, economics, and health. For more information, it can be found in the Facebook group, the PEACE Movement. Together, the three of us discuss why we believe Millennials and Gen Zs are leaving church, as well as why we believe Black history isn't taught as thoroughly. I learned so much from Vanessa and Daniel, it's not even funny. And guys, I hope you learned something too. With that being said, let's get into the podcast. I hope you guys enjoy. Welcome everybody to another episode of Micah Spotlight. I am here with Mrs. Vanessa Bossard and Mr. Daniel Blair. How are you guys doing today?
Good. How about you, man?
I'm doing all right, Vanessa.
I'm good. Thank you for asking.
Why Gen Zs and Millennials are leaving church? That's the question of the day. We're going to start with Mr. Daniel first. Why do you believe that Millennials and Gen Zs are leaving church right now?
That's funny. I actually had a conversation with one of my friends who's a pastor last Saturday about this. And so there is what I would say a global reason. And then I would say more specifically, I even think that there's a reason within the African American church. Globally, I think that, millennials are more accepting now. They have always, if you look at like right now, it baffles me that the kids that were born in 2001 when 9/11 happened, I mean, they're adults now. It's like, whoa, I just think that to me was like yesterday. I mean, and most people can relate. They know where they were, what was going on because it's such an imprint in our brain. But this this generation of millennials have always had a sense of community because of technology. So, they've always had a way to contact their friends through the outlet of social media and cell phones and texting. And so I think one of the greatest atrocities that they see within the church is that the church is no longer the community that it should be as it relates to representing Christ. A lot of people always talk about Christ and their personal savior. And so it's like, oh, well, if he's my personal savior, then that means that I somehow have this trademark on salvation that you have to now work towards. And so it strips us of the community that I think it strips us of the community that Christ taught, our Father. He didn't say, if you become a Christian, he will just be your Father. He said our Father. And so I think globally, one of the biggest issues is that millennials just don't see the community within the church anymore. They see that, okay, you can go at 8, you can go at 10, and you can go at 11 for corporate worship on Sunday. And some churches, a lot of churches do have good outreach, but it's not in the sense that it's non-judgmental as the millennials would like it to be. They still kind of struggle with condemnation and things like that. So I think that's one of the things on a broad level within the African American church I could talk about a lot. But one of the things that I hear a lot is that a lot of African American preachers still preach as if we're in the civil rights era. And they still preach this almost a type of sermon that makes the congregation have this self-fulfilled prophecy of living a hard life. God will always make a way. Well, and it's like, so subconsciously, some people feel like, okay, at this point, we know he will. Like, I need life application. Don't keep telling me he's going to make a way, because for me, that just subliminally says that I need to always be in a pinch where I need God to make a way, when, Jesus taught if you live by principles, you don't need a miracle. Miracles were just a sign for him. So I think that's one of the struggles, and that's just a broad level because, I'm not the only one on here, but that's just a broad level of some of the tips of subjects is like globally, we just, as a church, millennials just don't find it as relevant anymore. They want to embrace everybody, especially, the LGBTQ community. So for them, it's like, well, if they feel like the church shuns that community, then it kind of leaves them in the middle because they want to embrace both,
Mm-hmm. And Vanessa, your response?
Yes, I am very passionate about this topic. I will contend and defend my generation and every generation after me. But first, I want to say not all churches are this way. And also, millennials have not left God.
Right.
They've just left the church. And it's for many reasons. Millennials and down further, after us, were the most gifted generation, were the most cause-oriented generation. And I feel like the church has gotten to a point where it's lacked mission. It's gotten very stuck in its ways. Also, millennials don't like tradition. Millennials don't like to follow suit, just to anything just because you say. Because we're going to be like, well, why? Why is it this way? We test every cause and we question everything. Because we're also one of the most innovative. So we want to know how to do things simpler or differently. Also, another reason, we've been talked down upon our whole lives. We go to school, we're talked to, at home, we're talked to, and then we go to church, something that's optional for a lot of people, just to be sat down and talked to. And I feel like even in that talking and even raising us up, you can't tell us that Jesus is the way. You can't tell us to believe in Jesus and to follow every commandment of Jesus. And then in our personal lives and at home, you don't even match up. You don't even match up to what the church is telling us. You're smoking and drinking and cussing and doing all this type of stuff at home. And then you're holier than thou on Sundays. And that's another thing. Millennials aren't fake. They're not ascribing to things that are not real. And so if they see you living one way and then you get here and you're acting another way, they just can't get with it. They can't make that connection to it. Also, every 500 years, the church has a reformation, and we are at that another 500-year mark of the reformation of the church.
Can
And
you explain the Reformation?
um, it started with the Protestant Reformation. I believe it was in the 1500s, I believe. So every 500 years, there's a change. There's somebody who challenges what the church is. Like he didn't believe.
Okay.
He believed in the Holy Spirit. Martin Luther was the leader of the Protestant Reformation. He believed in the Holy Spirit, and so it challenged every single tradition that they had at the time, and it caused a lot of people to separate from the church and start this where we are now. And I think moving forward, because we are at that 500-year mark again, I know for a fact that millennials are going to lead us into this next reformation of the church. And so I can keep going on and on about it. I actually took more notes of it. Actually, to his point, there is a lot of judgment in the church. There's a lot of cliques in the church, and millennials, they are about community. They want to touch everything and everyone. And so, like I said, like I started out, this isn't every church, but and millennials are not leaving God. In fact, I think they are gaining a different spiritual perspective and a different relationship with God than the church has been trying to force upon us. Because I even found myself in that point. I grew up in a church. I love the church. I will never condemn the church. But I even found myself to the point where I was like, I don't see myself fitting in here. I don't look like any of this. And I think a lot of millennials feel the same way.
You know what? Speaking from, because I'm Gen Z, so I would speak on. I agree with you guys' statements. But one thing that Vanessa, that you said is that when it comes to the judgment part, is because that's one of the reasons why I believe that my generation is not really going to church as much, because anytime that we do go and that we do have an idea, it's looked down on because we're young and we really can't do much. And it's more like sit down and be quiet type of thing. You know how many times we got told that growing up? Sit down and be quiet, sit down and be quiet. And so coming at it from my perspective is just like, even if you do speak up, who's going to listen? And so I actually have my friend named Shay. She goes to Christ United Methodist. It's up in Columbus. And one of the things that they do is that their youth has a chance every Sunday of every month to give a sermon. And the church that I grew up in, that is unheard of. So for a child or for anybody, like they always say that you have to go to, is it seminary or what's the?
Yeah.
Seminary, Bible college.
You would have to go there in order to be behind the pulpit. Like, do you feel like it's multicultural with everybody leaving, or do you just feel like it's only particularly Black people? We can start with Mr. Daniel first.
I feel like it's multicultural. I think it's a travesty to hear, what you're saying about growing up, you were told to sit down, because I had the opposite experience when I was growing up. I mean, we were encouraged to do that. But
really?
Oh yeah. I was preaching when I was 13. When I was 13 years old, I was, my pastor saw a gift and right away was like, hey, you need to do this. So I didn't have that, I would say I didn't have that experience, but I do think that it is a global issue as far as who's leaving the church. And again, I think there's a lot of things behind why. But again, one of the things is I just feel like that, this generation doesn't feel like they're represented well. either. Like you were just saying, if you're told to sit down and be quiet, then it's kind of like, okay, well, I just don't fit in here, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, what's the point of me coming if there's no representation of me and what I, as a valuable person, can bring to this congregation? So I think it is on a massive level, and I do agree with you even about the whole education piece. I do think a lot of churches now are doing that, where they want you to have some. The problem with another problem that I think is happening with the church is we're adopting a lot of the issues or a lot of the systems that the world has, and so like where you see the companies and big business requiring people to have more education, master's degrees, and things like that. I think it has somehow infiltrated the church where people are, wanting, lay members to have a certain level of education. Not that, you shouldn't just get up there and you don't know anything about the Bible. However,
Right.
I think that there are some people who just learn it well. If I study it every day on my own and I read it and I believe it and I have the revelation given by the Holy Spirit, then I shouldn't have to wait on a seminary degree to be able to, reach the congregation with the message that I feel like, God wants me to share,
Vanessa?
Okay, so I'm going to touch on both points. Is it multicultural and seminary? So yes, it is multicultural. Even looking at from minority to majority, which, okay, we'll just call it what it is. Even looking at black and white, the millennials and the Gen Zs, we don't see it how previous generations have seen it. We're friends with everybody. We have friends of all types of backgrounds. And so, yes, it's not just one particular set of people leaving the church. It's what are my friends doing? What is my community doing? And also, even I know I have Asian friends. They have even left. They are even leaving the church, and they are more tight knit than the black church. They are even leaving their church because they see something different. Like I've had many conversations with some of my Asian friends about what they left and the reasons why they left it. And even one friend said, the black church, they're just so convinced about what they believe in. And she said, I wanted to know why. Like they're just passionate about it. And I was like, well, yeah, we are. And there's many reasons why that we are. But so yes, to answer your question, it is a multicultural movement of millennials. Also, to seminary. I will never say, don't go to Bible college, to seminary. I will never, ever say that because I do believe in studying to show thyself approved. And I do believe you have to be able to rightly divide the word. I do believe in that. But I also, just as strongly as I believe in that, I strongly believe that God has a generation of people who he is just raising up himself, like just all types of wisdom and knowledge and just prophetic insight. And you don't even know how a person can be this young and understand the word like that. And so I believe in it. So unless the Holy Spirit says, no, you don't have to go, I do believe in you going somewhere to study. I do believe.
With all the young, I'm gonna call them youngsters, with all the youngsters now in church, how would you guys go about enticing or promoting to try to bring in more people from our generation to church? Let's start with Daniel.
I think based on the laugh on her face, we should have just right to her like, oh boy.
Go ahead. Did you want to go first, Vanessa? I'm sorry.
It's your show, man.
You just look like you had something good that hit you.
Yeah, let's start with Vanessa. Go ahead, Vanessa.
Okay, so I too spoke with my pastor about this, topic of millennials leaving. And he said something. I told him I was going to repeat what he said. I told him, I said, I'm going to use this. He said millennials don't need for you, the question is, how do you reach millennials? That's what every pastor in America has been asking. How do you reach millennials? And he said, if you get to that point of asking how to reach millennials, you have already lost it and you've already failed,
Wow.
because reaching millennials is not what you need to do. If you are providing resources and guidance for millennials and a space for them to be themselves, they will come. What millennials need is the guidance and the resource that these churches have. And I firmly believe it's within the resources that the church leaders have, their wisdom and guidance, and then just they can open so many doors and just let them run through,
Mm-hmm.
I'm 100% agreeing with my pastor on that. It's not reaching them that we need to do. It's providing the resources and opening our doors wide.
Daniel?
Um, to just piggyback that, I believe every generation has had that question of how do you reach, because of course even us now, it's like, I mean, our parents looked at us and said, oh, this is a crazy generation. Their parents looked at them and said, oh, this is a crazy generation. But I feel like the gospel of Christ is transcendent through each generation, and when you learn to preach it in a way that would reach the 80-year-old and reach the 5-year-old, you never have to ask, how do we draw people in? I think one of the biggest things that happens in ministry, as we just discussed, is everybody is not included in a sermon. And so when you preach a sermon that's only geared towards a certain demographic that, is a portion of your congregation, then, if all you're talking about in your sermon is, loving your spouse, loving your husband and your wife or whatever, but I am a, 18-year-old who I'm just trying to figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life, and you do a 5-week series on marriage, which is very necessary. The problem happens in that is a lot of pastors don't include that 18-year-old and say, but now, even though this message is for the married population, I do still want to talk to those who are not in this situation. And I want to even give you keys and principles so that you can start mapping out how to get to that place. We kind of lock sermons in, and we kind of lock our outreach into a certain demographic to the point that, again, millennials, just like she said, they don't have a space. They don't feel like, okay, now this sounds good. And, for some charismatic churches, everybody said amen and clapped. But now on Monday, how do I apply this to my life? Like how, when I am a single person, and I do want to be married or whatever, just using that same example, how do I, as a single person, use some kind of principle from your marriage series that I've just been exposed to? So, or even monetarily wise, just Jesus is Jesus. His message is salvation. You can see the message of salvation from creation all the way up through Revelations. You can see just the Bible is this cohesive message that is, God is love. He wants us to flourish. He wants us to prosper. And if we could just find a way to preach that without having an expectation, because the thing is, a lot of what we preach that's preached in a church, I feel like, is preached with expectation of some kind of outcome. You want a bigger marriage ministry, or you want this or whatever. But to reach millennials, as she said, you just have to preach love. If God is love, we can't preach hate. If is acceptance, and some people say, well, they talk about the principles of God and things like that. And yeah, I'm a parent. I love my kids. I want them to flourish. Now, I do have guidelines for them, but they're not to the point where I want them walking around feeling condemned to the point that they can't even relate to me. And I think the church has taken that relatability to Christ and his message, and the message of love and the message of peace, away from them. And so they're like, well, I got no place here. I can't identify with this.
Can I add to that? Because he made a couple things spring up in me. as it relates to sermons and preaching, millennials, they need to see, we relate to transparency. We relate to you standing up there being vulnerable, not putting on whatever facade you have. If we can see your humanness and not this spiritual thing that you've built up for Sunday mornings, if we can see your humanness, oh my God, you've got us. Like we're not just this crazy generation with no emotions, full of rage and full of high other emotions. You know what I'm saying? We want to be able to relate to you. So if you can give us that transparency and that vulnerability, you have us. But also, what was it? I thought about something else. Okay, yeah, he said, I don't know who this quote is attributed to, but I heard this saying. It says, salvation is free, but discipleship has a cost. I think that's another reason nobody is teaching the cost. Salvation is free, but every other part of it, it is tough. It is hard. Being a real true follower of Jesus Christ, there is a cost to it. Every time somebody came to Jesus in the Bible saying, "What can I do to be saved?" or "What can I do to follow you?" or "What can I do to get into heaven?" Lay down your life and follow me. Sell everything you have and follow me. Like it's a legit cost. And even with new believers, not just young believers, even with the new people who are coming into Christianity, once the honeymoon phase or the feel good phase is over, they don't know what to do because nobody taught us how to pay the cost. Nobody even speaks about the cost, especially in the way that young people can apply it and it set in. So you made those two things jump in my spirit when you're speaking. So that's all I wanted to add to it.
You talked about the cost of going to church and following Jesus. Something that I feel like my generation doesn't like to do, or doesn't like getting told what to do all the time. And so also I feel like when people start to talk about God, they look at it as a bad thing of, I can't cuss, I can't smoke, I can't drink, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do this, I can't do that. And so people have this image of religion in a certain, like in a way that it's just not good, which I also feel like can turn people away because of the fact that it's just the way that church is portrayed, and plus the way that, like, people see, people might not go to church, and then all of a sudden you see the guy standing on the corner with the megaphone talking about you're going to hell if you do this. And then that can automatically turn somebody off. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So that's how I feel. My generation just doesn't like being told what to do. I want to ask you guys two more questions as it relates to this topic, because I wanted to switch over to the other topic that we discussed. Do you feel obligated for you to stay at your own church that you grew up in, even if you feel like you don't have a spiritual connection there anymore?
Can I interject? So like she said, when, I was talking, something sprung up. When you were just talking about that, it made me really think of something that the church misses. As far as not people, it is an innate thing to be rebellious. When God said to Eve and Adam, don't eat this, you could have everything else, but just don't eat this. What happened? They ate it. And so that's where, again, I was saying that the message of Christ is so simple. We really do make it hard. But the one thing that Jesus understood in his teaching, if you notice, he never said, thou shalt not. What he always did, because he knew the rebellion in man's heart, is he used an affirmative. He said, okay, so when you pray, this is what you do. When you give, this is what you do. Because he knew that if he came with the same script of the Old Testament, thou shalt not, people wouldn't have heard him. They wouldn't have opened their hearts because of the rebellion of man's heart. So I think that's the other thing. Like you were saying, people feel judged and we don't want to be told what to do. I feel like that is a key thing that is missing from the verbiage of Christ, is that he's not telling us, don't do this, don't do this. He's saying, hey, do this, because the benefit of doing this is this. And if you can articulate it in a way like that, it's a positive message that people will be happy to participate in, versus, as you said, feel like they've been told don't do this, don't do this. That was all I got to know.
You win nobody by placing fear in them.
Yeah.
You win nobody.
Was that your response to the question?
Me?
Yes, Vanessa.
No, my response to the question is no, I do not feel tied to just because I grew up in a church. I have to remain there. No, no, I do not believe in that, because there are some places, first of all, different denominations change leadership like every few years. So why can I not change if something doesn't fit, or if I'm not growing or if I plateaued in my growth at a certain place? Why not? And especially, I went to my church, my childhood church, because my grandmother said, this is the church we going to. So as I get older, I want to be able to make some decisions about my own life. I want to go out into the world and see where I fit in, or what speaks to me. You know what I'm saying? So no, I don't believe you have to. But I also, I would love for the place where I do settle at, I would love for it to be a place where I get married in and my children grew up in. And like, I would love for that to be that. So I can see why it's been that way. But no, as you get older, I would love for my children to have free reign in making those decisions for themselves.
Do you feel like Black people look down at the younger generation if they leave church? The older Black generation looks down?
Yes, I do.
Daniel?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's the whole idea of, the Black generation, especially the older, I mean, their thought process, and it was, the American way too. You get a job and you stay at that job and you retire. You buy a house. The whole idea of like our generation with starter homes, that just wasn't a thing then. You buy the house and you live there for 50 years with your spouse and your kids and you die. And so with church, it was the same way. Your church is your church because especially in that older generation, generally the members were the foundations of these churches, where it was their invested money that, either built the church or in their mind kept it going. So they had a vested investment. So yeah, it's kind of like when when the younger generation is not staying, they kind of look at them as unstable and things like that. And as she said, is I think a lot of times what is happening is we're not unstable, we're just trying to find a place that speaks to us and that we actually feel that we can grow in. I love in my yard it's summertime, so I plant banana trees, love them. But now I know when the temperature drops below 38 degrees, they're done, because this is not the climate that they thrive in. So I have the choice where I have to dig up the roots and store them for the winter. And so for me, if we could understand that even spiritually, that everyone doesn't thrive in every congregation, they have to find that. They have to find that climate where they feel a part of. But I do think that there's an older demographic of church members that if you leave, or if you even miss 2 Sundays in a row, they like, oh, you
right. Yeah, I definitely agree. Because also when I was in church in my home church, what we used to do every Martin Luther King Day was we used to go and we used to learn about the history of Martin Luther King, and that's going to bring me into our next point. Black history was taught in schools, and then I talked to some Black people where it says Black history was taught every now and then. My first question. Why do you guys believe that Black history isn't taught or isn't pushed as much as white history?
Because white history is tied so much into Black history. The destruction of Black history, correct me if I'm wrong, it did start during slavery, but also even after, well, even as we started to come out of slavery, there was excuse my terminology, but this is the only term that I have for it. There was a whitewashing that happened all over. It's in the inventions, it's in the artwork, it's in every museum. Um, Even artifacts being stolen from indigenous people or black and brown people to fill up majority museums, and even just so as you know, the whitewashing of Jesus Christ. So it's just to push that the dominance of the white supremacy. So we were taught what we were taught, to whitewash us into believing that black and brown people are here and we're going to keep them down here. They cannot do anything great but work for us. They stole our inventions, they stole our writings, they've taken everything from us, and we're still great.
Daniel?
So I think that's a twofold. There's two answers to that. And let me make sure I got the question right. Your question is, why do we think that African American history hasn't been taught?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll try to be quick because this is a subject that I'm really passionate about right now.
You're good. You're good.
I really feel like that if we understood the truth in it, a lot of what we see going on in the world right now, it would be demolished. But that is the 2 points of why we don't have Black history. So after slavery, slaves are freed, and the whole idea of us being equal was something that was really happening in our country. If you look at the history, right after the Civil War, Black people were voting. Black people were actually elected officials. So it really breaks my heart when I see like the news and they say, oh, the first Black elected, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, nope, sorry. If you really do your history, right after slavery was abolished, there was a massive amount of African Americans in government, which is one of the reasons that the Jim Crow laws were founded, because we had began to show an intellect that was as equal and in some ways even more advanced than theirs, because while we were wiping off the dining room table and hearing their conversations about a budget, we were running numbers in our head and we knew how to do certain things. So then you let somebody who's been exposed to these ideas and things like that for years, all of a sudden be released with all of this built up information. They're powerful. And so one of the reasons it's not taught is because if you make a demographic of people feel like you've never been anything but a submissive, passive part of society who was only good for working in the field, it's ridiculous that a lot of people don't know about the many slaves that had rebellions. I mean, there were slave owners and their entire houses who were burned down to the ground. And the only reason that we don't hear about that is because if you hear about a whole group of Black people who led a rebellion, then that says that there's strength in that group of people. And so a lot of things have been stolen, because if I can make you feel like you're nothing by saying you've never been anything, you've totally depended on me to take care of you from the time you stepped on this land, you've never made any contribution other than the one I allowed you to make, then what it does is it makes you a subconscious victim. And so then when you become empowered, no matter what you do to try to become empowered, you still got this little voice in your head saying, but we've never done anything like this. I've always been dependable on them or depending on them. And so in order for me to be successful, I have to go to this white person to actually be successful, because they have been the hand that fed me and got me where I am, which is, it's not the truth. But then on the flip side, if you look at the message to the white people of America, if they also are subconsciously programmed that these people are beneath us, they have done nothing but what we've told them to do. They've only made the contributions that we've allowed them to make. I mean, Black people were in human zoos. I mean, it's just disgusting to know the level of disrespect that we endured, but we endured it. And again, on my timeline on Facebook, I posted the other day about Juneteenth and just the history of that. And it baffled me the amount of people, Caucasians, who didn't know about it. They literally didn't know what it was, why we celebrated it, why it was such a big deal. But they didn't know about it because it was hidden, so that when someone was racist and said, oh, you know, black people aren't as smart, then it's like, yeah, and there's no proven record that they are. Looks like we built this country. Looks like, you know, we did everything. And so it's a two-way street where if I can make you feel like you're nothing and you had to depend on me to become something, and then if on the same narrative I say I was the reason that you got what you got, then when you try to in any way exceed me, then I have to now knock you back down because I'm like, wait a minute. You didn't get what you got without me. And again, that was the reason for Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws was because all of a sudden, these people who had been nothing, you know, to America except for laborers, were vital parts of our economics, vital parts of our government, and things like that. And so, if I'm used to, you know, if my children, if I have 5 children, and all 5 of my children are wanting to serve in government, and it was a guarantee 10 years ago when slaves was out in the field, but now that slaves are freed and they can be in government, and now only 3 of my 5 children can be in government because there's 2 spots that they just got voted into, then I need to fix that because we are better than them and they have no. So it's a dual story that was done. I mean, gosh, it's a lot of information. The Daughters of Confederacy, you know, the whole thing about these monuments and things like that. If people would research why these monuments were put up, you know, it was publicly on the premise of, oh, well, the dying population of the Confederate soldiers are, you know, they're dying. So they, it was like from 1890 up until 1914, where they had this huge push to put these monuments up to commemorate the Confederacy. But what I don't understand, maybe y'all can explain it, is the Confederacy lost. I've never seen a losing side to the monument. I'm like, how you gonna get? That's like the, you know, we play in the Super Bowl and the losing team right there getting a trophy too. No, you lost.
Yeah. I understand, and that's the same thing that I say. I'm like, I don't understand. Are they sore losers? Like, I just don't understand the concept behind still repping a loser. But Vanessa, did you have a rebuttal?
No, I enjoyed that.
Okay. Daniel, go ahead. You were about to say something else?
Well, so here's the thing about it is it is, if you look at what happened, so I always tell people, do research, like just read. Thankfully, the North didn't destroy all of history because the South did. And the South destroyed it based on what we as the world know, the brilliance of a woman. Women are brilliant. And you put a group of women together, I don't care if they black, white, or whatever, they're going to get something done. So you had what was called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. These were the descendants, and some of them were the actual widows of the Confederate soldiers who had died. These people, yeah. And so here's what's so funny about this is, you think in 1865, I think it was, slaves in America was worth about $63 billion. We were a big booming business. Well, after the Civil War, the slave owners got to keep all that money. Nope, they didn't have to, you know, give it up. So they done made all of these millions of dollars all of these years. So when they die, now these wives and these widows have this whole pocket of money, and they start basically coming up with these subliminal ways to say, guess what? We are going to paint ourselves in a different way. And so one of the things they did was that it's called the lost cause. One of the things they did was started with education. They started pushing for legislation in the South that when books for school were written, that it would not paint the South in a negative light. And if they were, then the government officials should not allow that in the schools. If you look, there's a book called, I read it online like about 2 weeks ago. It's called The History of Georgia. And in this book, it is a disgusting line. I'm not even gonna lie. I just turned my laptop off.
What's the line?
In there, there's a story where the writer of this book, The History of Georgia, says that the slave owners were great to their slaves. They would have barbecues and treat them well, and the slaves were happy. Now you imagine, and I'm not kidding, look it up. The book is called The History of Georgia. It is a real old textbook that was in some ways used until the 1970s. So if I'm like a Caucasian kid growing up in America and I read that, I'm like, well, why was it so bad? Like, we were taking care of them, and they were dependent on us, and it was just a good working relationship. And so it was like the brainwashing of a nation, even in subliminal ways. So those Daughters of Confederacy basically created this huge group. The monuments, many of them have their initials somewhere on them. UDC, the United Daughters of Confederacy. So what they did was they made it look like, oh, we are putting these monuments up because the Confederate soldiers are passing away. The guys in gray are passing away. But what it really was, and it's crazy because people today, this is kind of like the Bible being in action. You reap what you sow. So they put them up with the idea of saying, we're commemorating these Confederate soldiers. Well, the Confederate soldiers were fighting to say that slavery should have continued. Point blank. Some people think that like it was because of states' rights. No, it was over slavery. We know that. So they put these monuments up basically in a subliminal way to say, hey, guess what? Y'all free, but you still gonna see our hatred in public places. And so these monuments that are elaborate, and that some states were even, these women couldn't even vote, but they had such presence in the South that they even had some monuments funded by the states to put them up in state, in the state capitals. So like, again, it's just, if we know history, the people that are like, well, this is a part of history. Well, I'm sorry, but your history is a monument to hatred. And you don't even know that because you were bamboozled to think that it's just to commemorate this man. Well, this man, if it was up to this man, I'd still be picking cotton in 2020. So why are you commemorating him?
Vanessa, I would like to ask you, going through Black history and knowing what you know now, how important is it for Black people to actually know and actually take the time to do the research for Black history?
It's imperative. It is what is going to empower our people. First of all, knowing where you come from, that foundation, and knowing who you are. Just knowing who you are. That research is so very important for the future of African American culture, African American people.
Mm-hmm.
Just flat out. That's just the simplest way I can put it. Knowing where you come from and knowing who you are.
Vanessa, you are of a lighter skin complexion. So I do want to ask this question. When do you experience different forms of racism because you are a lighter skin complexion?
All of my life. I won't compare it because you don't compare plight. That's just ignorance and divisive. So yes, it's but you get it from both sides. You get it from your own people and you get it from other people. So yes, I have been most of my life. You're not Black, or you're not Black enough. So you don't really know. But no, I do know, because to them, I am just like you.
Mm-hmm.
I am just like you. We were under the same slavery. And if I get called a house Negro one more time in my life,
Oh,
we
wow.
were all under the same bondage.
Wow.
And that's how that whitewashing is. It gets you to turn on your own people. Like we were in the same slavery. Like there were people just as light as me back then. Like, and I still get it all my whole entire life. You wouldn't call a Caucasian friend Casper, but you would call me Casper.
Wow.
Like I just don't. I never understood it. I'm Black. Yes, I'm mixed with a whole bunch of things, but I'm still Black, baby, and I still claim it.
I was watching the Sandra Bland documentary on Hulu, and I found out that the first Black open heart surgery, successful heart surgery, was like performed by a Black man. Didn't know that. The founder of Chicago was Black. Didn't know that. The origins of the ice cream truck song is completely racist. Didn't know that either.
Yeah.
So I'm like, in the schools that I came up in, I never got taught any of this. So my question to both of you is, how thorough were you guys taught about Black history growing up? And I want to start with Daniel.
So I would say that I was taught as thorough as anybody else taught in the public school system. I went to, public school systems in America. I think the one thing that I have always been is a seeker of knowledge, and one of the reasons for that is because growing up in the church that I grew up in, we were taught to read the Bible for yourself, find God for yourself, know the scripture for yourself. And so for me, education has always been, whether it's spiritually or I guess what we would say historically, as far as our country or the world, because I just even like world history, it's always been something that I take upon myself to learn so that I have a right perspective in life. And so that, even as being a Christian, we should know the foundation of Christian values so that when we have to contend the faith, we are knowledgeable of it. And so when I, in America in 2020, say that I'm a Black man and I have just as much right to be anywhere in the United States or world as anybody else, I have the education to back up why. Because if you don't have the knowledge, one of the biggest issues of our generation is the travesty of sharing information on social media. People read stuff, and I'm telling you, I read some of the stuff that people share, and I'm like, they didn't even look this up to see if this was correct. There was a news clip a couple weeks ago with one of the riots, and it said that this man had been murdered by rioters, when the truth of the matter is a live stream on Twitter showed this white guy in the crowd with a sword trying to basically like launch at people. And so a couple of people got mad and beat him bad. But then there were a couple of other Black people that came and said, hey, enough. They didn't know what happened. They didn't see what happened, but they just knew that what was taking place in that moment had gone too far. And so education for me in America, as it relates to our schools, I think it was, as she said, it was whitewashed. It made me feel like that anything that ever came good from America was because of white people and because of their inventions and because they didn't quit and because, all of the drive that they had to make America great. We was just sitting in the background pouring tea and picking cotton while they were building the country. That was the subliminal teachings of public education to me.
Mm-hmm. Vanessa?
I thank God, and God rest her soul, that I had the grandmother that I had. She was an educator. She was a professor. She was a teacher all of her life. So for me, education never stopped. Like, you would come home from school and she would put us through her own form of education. And she really, really, really wanted us to know where we came from, where our people came from. So not just my African American side, but my Native American side as well. Like, we studied generations back, all the way back to slave owners in my family, and how my family actually got started. But also, she she would put us through so much, and we didn't like it at the time, but I so appreciate it now. So we went through different, like, we had to learn Swahili as children.
Wow.
We were taught Kwanzaa. We celebrated Christmas as well, but we were we celebrated Kwanzaa. We were part of this African group called, and we were young, like preteen age, maybe even younger. It was the Rites of Passage, and this was a group that we met with weekly. And then the same Mecca, the same Rites of Passage that the slaves went through to get through to America, we had a simulated version of that, and it was one of the worst experiences of my life. They took us out in the woods, blindfolded us, and they just put us through different things just to simulate even bits and pieces of what our ancestors experienced and what they went through. So as much as I didn't like it back then, I appreciate her teachings and her education so much now. Because I'm like him. I'm a seeker of knowledge, and I'm not just going to accept anything you place in front of me. And I get that from my grandmother. So yeah, they taught us whatever they wanted to teach us in school. My grandma had her own agenda when we got home.
Do you feel like we celebrate Black history the way it should be celebrated and remembered?
As a culture, as a community, or as a country?
Let's start. Let's start as a culture first, and then we can go as a country. Don't matter who goes first.
Real quick, I don't think that the African American community does because of fear of a backlash. I think that there's a demographic of African Americans who are scared that if we speak up and say like, hey, we should be celebrated just as much as this lying Christopher Columbus, who did not discover anything, we should be celebrated for what we actually did. I think that there's a demographic of especially now with the advent of social media and everybody, including your coworkers and things like that, you're connected to, there's a demographic of Black people who are afraid to celebrate it openly because they don't want to seem like they're one of the angry Black people. And it's like, no, it is, as with everything, it's the way you implement it. And so I don't think that it's celebrated even just within our community the way it should be, but partly also because we in our community don't know a lot of our history. So to celebrate something you're ignorant of is kind of like, I mean, it's a mute point. Like if I don't know what, like Juneteenth, if I didn't know what it was, then I can't celebrate it. And if I didn't know what it was because it was never taught to me. So I feel like it's a part ignorance, and then there's a part of fear because of a possible backlash from our professional colleagues.
Right. And I want to press you on that real quick. I'm gonna get to you real quick, Vanessa. So when you just said that of Black people like not knowing, how do we know? We just have to. Are you saying that Black people ourselves, we need to go in the internet and we need to research ourselves because of the fact that it's not taught? We need to take the initiative to go learn about our history. That's what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think anything that's important to you, you should know about. And so our history should be important to us. And so, yeah, I think that each of us should personally take especially the time we are in now. I don't care who you are and how ignorant you want to be. You have to admit that we are in a year like no other. And there is some change in the atmosphere from the fact that we were quarantined for weeks. And then all of a sudden we got Germany and Paris and everybody else in the street for injustices that are taking place in America and that are actually putting pressure on them to say, hey, we need to rethink the way that we do things. So I think it's really important and pivotal to us at this point in this time and space in history that we educate ourselves even more. So again, that we can rightfully defend what we need to bring up and deal with.
Vanessa?
In its current format, in its current form of understanding, it's hard to celebrate generations upon generations of suffering. It is hard. Black culture gets celebrated every single day. Black culture is appreciated every single day, but history, it's hard to look at it and see nothing but suffering. But even to his point, we are, number one, ignorant to real facts, to truth. But even when we go to express our celebration of, uh, let's say, the name isn't coming to me, but the guy who actually invented the light bulb, electricity, but they tell you it's Thomas Edison. So even if you go to
I
celebrate
thought it
something,
was Thomas Edison.
yeah, because that's what they teach us.
No.
No, no.
Oh.
But so even if I wanted to say, even if I wanted to celebrate it, I forgot his name. And that's my bad. Even if I wanted to celebrate that, it will come with so much backlash and rebuttal.
Mm-hmm.
Just for me, hey, my lights is coming on today. Thank you, black man.
Uh-huh.
Like, just it would just come with so much, you know. No, that's
Uh-huh.
Thomas Edison. Get your facts straight.
Thomas, Lewis Latimer,
Lewis sounds familiar.
because that's what they said. It says the light bulb itself was invented by Thomas Edison, but the innovation used to create longer lasting light bulbs with a carbon filament came
Electricity.
from African American inventor Lewis Latimer. Vanessa, I want to stay on you real quick. One thing that you texted me is you believe in one race or no race at all. Can you operationally define one race or no race at all?
Well, I was gonna say I have a couple disclaimers. I
Oh,
should have did it at the beginning,
I'm
but
sorry.
I was definitely gonna get back to it because we are using a lot of man-made terms in this call. We're saying black. We ourselves are categorizing ourselves, and we are saying white. Um, I do believe in one race or no race at all, and it's because and especially when it comes down to the church where it says where we feel like we need to be a black church and there has to be a white church and it has to be an Asian church. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that. Nowhere. But also, I just don't think God intended for us to be divided just by how we look or by our skin tones. I don't think that was his intention for mankind. Those were man-made terms to raise one up here and put one down here. So it's either one race or no race at all to me. That's just how I strongly feel.
Can I get your opinion on one race or no race at all, Daniel?
I totally agree with that, and here's why. Um, in an educated world, we realized that the first people were in Africa. And as they moved away from the equator and as their diets changed, so did the expression of their DNA to basically acclimate to where they lived. So when people went out of Africa and went north into the cooler places and they had to sleep in caves where they didn't get sunlight, their skin had to basically accommodate for that. And so they produced less melanin so that the little sunlight that they did get, they could produce the vitamin D necessary, which is, and then you look at the Asians who moved to the area that they moved in and they ate different vegetables and a lot of seafood, which then changed the expression of their DNA. But for me, I do agree with that because if we go all the way back to Adam and Eve and they had two sons, we look at these two sons and they were in fact one race. But the reason that one was able to kill the other had nothing to do with race. It had to do with the same thing we are dealing with in 2020. That was his brother. He had the closest genetic makeup at that moment. But the reason that Cain was able to kill Abel was because of a state of heart. And so even though they were one race, the state of his heart is the state of the heart of those who can hate today. It's the state of the heart of those who can say, okay, well, I'm going to be an activist for, this cause, but now I'm going to turn a blind eye to this because it's not convenient. And so I agree with one race, the idea of one race, because at the end of the day, if I'm laying on the bed and I'm dying and I need a blood transfusion, I'm not going to say, wait a minute, is that from a black person? I want you to give me the blood.
Right.
Live. If I need an organ, people, God bless now, or more than ever, I need a kidney or whatever. I have never seen a sign that says John needs a kidney, must be black. or my they like, I need a kidney. If you want to give it to me, I'll take it. So I do agree with the idea of one race, because at the core of who we are as educated people in 2020, we really are one race.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to this quote that I found, or this article that I found. So TNTP's her name is Satchel Harris. She wrote an article. The article is called "Black History is American History, and we should teach it that way." And this is a quote that I've gotten from her article. She says, "African Americans have made far too many contributions to all squeeze it into 1 month. Fortunately, this isn't the message most students get, with 80% of teachers being white and 40% of all public schools not having a single teacher of color. Black students across the country have been robbed of the opportunity to see themselves in what they're studying and experience the richness of Black history. Instead, they are being bombarded with negative narratives based on biases, prejudices, and stereotypes, forcing them to settle for raggedy and distorted views of who they are and what their culture represents." Um, do you guys agree with this statement? And if so, why? We're going to start with Vanessa.
Oh, of course you are. Um,
Ladies first.
Ladies first.
um, I do agree with the statement. I do agree there was a design to keep Black educators and Black history or anything associated with Black history out of the schools because of how rich it is. And because you have to admit a lot of things, you have to omit and admit a lot of things. So I do agree with this statement. I want to say this though, just as much as I don't believe in white supremacy, I don't believe in Black supremacy either.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want us to get our just due. I just want the same things you all want. I want to be able to stand in a space and breathe the same air and it not be a problem. I want to be able to sit in a classroom and get truthful, factual education, um, and it not be this big old uproar and you not be uncomfortable about it and I not be uncomfortable about it.
Mhm.
So yes, I agree with her statement. It just has a different type of tone to it. That's why I brought up Black supremacy.
Mhm.
So I do agree with what she said, but like I said, just give us our just due.
I feel like that's important too, because Black people aren't really asking white people for anything. We're just asking to be equal. We're not taking anything away from you. We don't want anything that you. We just want to be treated as equal. Daniel, what's your reaction to the article? The article quote that I just read.
I agree. I think, and I do agree that there is a fine line where we then become kind of arrogant, and we now become the perpetrators to try to say like, oh, we need to be recognized on the higher plane. But here's the danger in with us thinking we just want to be equal. We have to make sure that we articulate what equal is, because again, if equal in their mind is to make me equal is to take away from them, then equality is never going to be on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the perspective that a lot of people have, is for me to be equal, it means that I'm diminishing you. So for me to teach my Black history, it means that somehow now I'm diminishing the strong Caucasian heritage that has been taught. But the reality is, if you're teaching about World War One, teach about the Black troops in World War One simultaneously. And so
Mm-hmm.
I agree with her article that Black history should be taught as American history. If you're teaching a chapter on whatever, if you're teaching it on World War II, talk about those Black troops that stormed in as well. You don't have to have it where it's some special chapter, Black people, but if you mention this battalion, say, and there was also this Black battalion of soldiers who also were there, mention it. It doesn't have to be a whole chapter separately about it, but don't subtract and ignore our contribution. So I do agree. No, we don't need it to be a special, you got to take this African American history class. No, put it in that everybody's learning from. Because
that became a thing is because it was being left out. The African American history class.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a shame that we had to say this is going to be a class dedicated to teaching the true history of African Americans and their contributions to the United States. But at this point, I think, come on, y'all. Like, I don't know where y'all at, but I know it's too far for me to walk to you and to you. We have created a way to connect ourselves technologically in ways that, I mean, generations wouldn't have never thought, but we are still having a conversation of how just to, again, change the state of our heart and become one race and teach the truth and let the truth be the truth that unites us. Because the reality is, I think there's a lot of people who are just playing, this is not a derogatory term about country people because my family, a lot of them from the country, but they say playing country dumb. I think some people like to play ignorant and just like, well, I didn't know that, because again, if they knew it, it would change the dialogue of what they heard about Black people or what the media has portrayed of Black people. They would have to reformat their train of thought. So I do think teach it the same. You teaching this, you teaching about Christopher Columbus, tell what he really did. Tell about them blankets that they gave to the Indians that, you know, basically was warfare. What do you call it? I can't even think of the word, but basically chemical warfare. They knew they were giving these Indians these blankets that were infected and it would kill them. It wiped out villages. Tell that history because it's the truth and it helps us today understand the deficit of man's heart. And then in doing so, like with the story of Cain and Abel, if you look at what it is, then you have to search yourself and say, okay, how can I not be a part of that?
Guys, I have to be respectful of Vanessa's time because I know she has to go, but I do want to have this last question. And it's going to be a personal question. Vanessa, you have a nephew, and Daniel, you said that you have a son, or do you have kids? Do you have a son or a daughter? But I know I know you have kids. Is it a son or a daughter?
I have 3 boys and a daughter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How are you teaching? I wanted to come to Vanessa first. How do you have the talk with your nephew of being a Black man in America? What is that talk like? And how are you trying to educate him or help educate him to be a Black man in America?
Well, he's 6, so it's very light and delicate. Sprinkle it on him. The majority,
I should say.
The majority of what I tell him is I affirm him of who he is. He's a king. I tell him that he's 6, and I tell him you're a king. I tell him that your Blackness, your skin color doesn't make you different. It doesn't make you less, and it doesn't make you better. But I also, as far as our Black history, he probably knows more about Harriet Tubman, Jackie Robinson, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. He probably knows more about those historical Black figures than I do now at this point. It's just that what I said earlier, just knowing where you come from. Like, so you don't have to answer a whole bunch of questions when you become an adult man. You don't have to answer a whole bunch of questions. You know where you come from. You know who you are, because I'm going to keep affirming that. So because he's so young right now, I protect him at all costs. There's a lot of things I won't let him see or hear. There's a lot of things I don't want him to know at 6 years old. If he was a little bit older, I would give him the truth, but I'm not. I don't even know if I'm ready to have that conversation if he was a little bit older.
Daniel?
The biggest thing that I try to express to them is our hearts, because I don't want to raise children who grow up thinking that we're separate. I don't want them to think that it's them against us. Because again, if they do that, then it subconsciously keeps them in a place that doesn't allow them to experience a lot of things. If they walk around with a chip on their shoulder because they are Black men, then there are certain things that they won't even aspire to be because they're going to automatically think, well, I'm a Black man. And so, the system is against me. And so what I do is with my daughter as well, I have taught them history. I've taught them about the history and the contributions that we made, that the Black man that's in the picture with George Washington on the Delaware River was not a slave. He, in fact, helped win that part of the war. And if you know that we have been a great part of our American heritage and story, then it doesn't make you better or less important than your white classmate. It makes you understand that even if, and that's the thing that I've taught them too, ignorance, in our society, people think ignorance, again, is a negative word. Ignorance by definition says you just don't know something. And there's a large demographic of the Caucasian race in America who they don't know history. And so for them, they just know what they heard their grandma and grandpa say about Black people at the table. And then they knew that because that's what their parents were taught. So for me, the biggest thing that I teach them, number one, is God has to be at the forefront of our conscience. And if he is, then he will be in our hearts, and he will give you discernment of who should be your friends and who should not be your friends. If they are racist, if they're a bigot, if you saw them just say something nasty about the person of their same race, about that person's shirt, about that person's shoes, about that person where they live, you better open your eyes, because as soon as you walk away, they just may say something about you. So you have to be educated that it's a heart problem. It's not always a race problem. It's a heart problem that if I can perpetrate on this level, then I can perpetrate. It's like the great saying that Martin Luther King said, injustice in anywhere, or what did you say?
Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
Exactly. Everywhere. It's like it. And I think of, the Bible, an unstable man is unstable in all his ways. What you do in one area, you will do in all. So if you have an outlook on, poor people, like, oh, they beneath me, then you probably have a race issue too. So I just try to teach them, like I said, the heart of it. Don't go around with a chip on your shoulder. But also, as Jesus said, watch and pray. Demand respect, not in an arrogant way. Know what you bring to the world. Know that you are brilliant. I mean, with my kids, I often say it. I feel fortunate that God blessed me with the souls that I'm in charge of. And so to me, I feel like it's our job, and even in the Caucasian community, worldwide, we need to instill the idea of a heart. What does your heart look like? Because in Proverbs it says, guard your heart with all diligence, because from there, that's where the issues of life come. So if you hateful in your heart, you're gonna be hateful to everybody. So that's the way. Like I said, I teach them, and I open it up, and they can ask questions, and I point out the as I always love the terms of country people. Country people I always point out the good white folk. I always tell them, I'm like, while Frederick Douglass was writing, his articles about the atrocities of slavery in the North, he was backed by a lot of wealthy white people. So we can't look all of them and say like all white people are terrible and all white people, that's unfair, because at the same token, then we wouldn't expect, like the whole thing that just happened lately where there's these rioters, and it's like, well, when the rioters and the looters, when it happened, it was basically pressed upon us through the media that it was all Black people. And so we, again, if we embrace, which I like that idea, embrace the notion of one race, it's not about your skin color. It's about what your heart look like. What you doing there? Because you need to fix that.
Yeah.
It's not about your skin color. It's about the heart. I love that quote, and that's what I'm going to end it on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for being on the podcast. Vanessa and Mr. Daniel, I really, really appreciate y'all taking the time out and discussing these things with me.
right.
Micah,
Yep.
Micah, I just got a couple more things to say.
Talk to me.
I know. I'm trying to get off for you. Go on.
We have used a whole lot of man-made terms. I do want to just say, Black, white, Asian, whatever. I don't care. I don't like the label. We are better and we are stronger together. Also, we spoke about the generations that came before us. Another disclaimer. Just because us millennials and Gen Zs, we like to have our freedom and we appear to be young, wild, and free in everything that we do, we still need your guidance. We still need your wisdom. Just don't place us in this box anymore. Also, Micah, I love what you're doing. I love the young man that you have grown up to be. Oh my gosh, am I getting emotional? Yeah, a lot of people don't know, but when I was homeless, when me and my family was homeless as a child, your family, I love your whole entire bloodline. Your family took us in. We were running away from an abusive father. So your mother and your family, they took us in and we're still tight and we still operate like I feel like I'm in y'all's family. So it's so cool to see the man that you have grown into be. I love you. I love you and I appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. I love you too. And my mom always talks about that too. You're always going to be a part of the family. Daniel, I really appreciate you so much. And it was the first time meeting you and we had a ball. I look forward.
Yeah, I'll plug that too. You know, like I worked with your mom for years. And I mean, I remember when she was like, oh, she was so excited. She said, I got to tell you something. I'm like, what? And she's like, Micah feels like he's being called to ministry. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. So it's so good. Like when she was sharing your video, I was just like, wow, like this is so good. It is. I have to agree. It's just, I love to see this. And to me, it's like we got to promote people like you because promoting you also overall promotes our image that we do have a young demographic of Black men who are not on the corner with their pants hanging down, baby daddy's thugs, but they are doing constructive things to cultivate a better culture within our community in the world. So I gotta agree with her. Like I'm serious. I wish I could show you the text I sent your mom when she sent me your thing. I'm like, what? Look at this. So
you guys will always be a part of Micah Spotlight. Anytime that you guys feel an issue that needs to be addressed, this platform is always open to you and anybody that you guys know. So thank you guys once again. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. See you guys.
See you guys.
All right.
Thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast. I hope that you have learned something, and I would actually love to hear your perspective on this topic. Feel free to comment in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And actually, make sure you share it out. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, peace!